Got to find my glasses so I can see. Hi, I want to welcome all of you to the forum. I'm Florence Graves, an investigative journalist, and also an IOP, I'm pleased to say, IOP research fellow, and the Alicia Patterson Foundation is also supporting my work on the imbalance of power between women and men in Washington. I want to thank Charlie Royer, who's the head of the Institute, and Heather Campion, who is the head of these forums, and her assistant, Marisa Fusaro, who has handled all the logistics. Thank you all. I mean, people don't realize what it takes to put one of these together. And thanks also to Jeanette Fruin, who's somewhere in who handled all the logistics for the Oregon people. Thank you. The topic of our topic today, sexual harassment, is both a personal and a political issue. And we want to talk about that today. And I think our title, Where Do You Draw the Line?, is even more appropriate than I realized when Heather named it. Because today we will be talking about where to draw many lines. Where do you draw the line personally? Do you ignore it? Do you fight back on the spot? Do you take it to an authority at school or work? Do you press charges? Do you leave your job? And then more globally, where do we draw the line politically as a matter of social and public policy? Some men have told me that it's just gotten so confusing lately that they're afraid to say anything to women. So I think it's also very important to talk about the difference between flirting and attention that is not offensive and sexual harassment. We may find it's easier to draw that line than many men, at least have seemed to indicate to me. Over the past few days, a few of them have stopped me in the hall. Helping us sort all these issues out are going to be Martha Langland, who's the author of Back Off. I would highly recommend this book. It's really superb. She's a senior economist at the Department of Transportation in Washington. She's an experienced self-defense instructor, and she's also the past president of the Washington, D.C. Rape Crisis Center. Also, Liz McKenna, who is an attorney in Portland who specializes in sex discrimination and sex harassment cases, and she's representing some of the Packwood women pro bono. Julie Williamson is an Oregon political consultant who most recently designed the winning campaign of Congresswoman Elizabeth First. Gina Hutton is a small business owner in Oregon who Packwood tapped to help run one of his Senate campaigns. And Judge Betty Roberts, who's the former Oregon Supreme Court Justice, director of the Women's Legal Advocacy Fund, who also, in terms of full disclosure, ran against Senator Packwood for the U.S. Senate a while ago. I want to set the stage for our discussion and then turn to our panel for more in-depth discussion in several areas. And after that, I want to open it up to your questions, and you'll need to go to one of the microphones so that your questions can be heard. Many women leaders I've interviewed believe that if Senator Packwood's case, now pending before the Senate Ethics Committee, is dealt with seriously, it will send a strong message, just as the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings did in their own way, about the prevalence and seriousness of sexual harassment and sexual abuse in this society. While we hope to get beyond Senator Packwood in our discussion today, his case does provide us with an excellent metaphor, because in some ways the Packwood story is a parable of our times. It's a story that illustrates both the personal and the political aspects of this issue. It's a story that reveals the still entrenched sexism in our culture, and it's a story about a society that still encourages the silencing of women's experiences. And finally, it's a story about all women who are beginning to find their voices, who are refusing to be good girls and take it. I want to stress one thing. When I, and I think others, talk in generalities about men and women, please understand that we don't mean all men and we don't mean all women. All of us have relatives and friends and colleagues who get it, who treat women with the dignity and respect they deserve. And let's not forget that there are women, sometimes blinded by ambition and personal interest, who are not always perfect in these situations either. In the next few minutes, I want to show you how the Packwood story illustrates patterns that are all too common in cases of sexual misconduct, especially when there's a significant imbalance of power. Patterns such as fear, silencing, the discrediting of those women who do speak out, and the failure of our institutions to take this issue seriously. But first, who is Bob Packwood? Now in his 5th term, he is known as a liberal Republican and a leading advocate of abortion. He has called feminists Gloria Steinem and Kate Michelman friends. There's not time to detail all of the stories we published in the Washington Post. Julie and Gina will be telling theirs. But generally, more than 20 women told Charlie Shepard and me, the other reporter, of a senator who often, out of the blue, would grab and French kiss them when a handshake would have been appropriate, who chased them around tables and desks, hoping to embrace and kiss them, who took advantage of chance encounters to make abrupt and unwelcome advances. By the time we published our Washington Post story, Senator Packwood had issued to us a letter of apology, not apologizing to us, but apologizing in general for his behavior, which we published at the same time the initial story last November was published. His attorney told me, when I asked him why the apology, he said, "Florence, you just have too much. Denial is not credible." Since then, however, the senator has indicated he plans to take a much more aggressive posture, suggesting at one point that his attorneys look forward to grilling the women making accusations. You know, I think one of the questions I'm asked most often is, how did you ever convince the Packwood women to break the silence, to tell their stories on the record? Unstated but implicit in that question is an understanding of the tacit code of silence that women in this society adhere to. Most people are astounded to learn that the Packwood case represents the first time in history that more than one woman has been willing to publicly make accusations of sexual misconduct against a U.S. senator. The first time in 200 years. The women sitting here, Julie and Gina, are really pioneers. But perhaps the silence is not so surprising when you think about it. As Harvard psychologist Dr. Irene Stiver explained to me, our culture has socialized women to keep silent. Women are told they must honor relationships, understand the other person's point of view, and accommodate the men who have the power. They are taught to take care of the male ego and to be good girls. Dr. Stiver explains that men, even those who are trying to be fair, just don't understand what it takes for the woman to be the accuser, to hurt the man, even if he has been awful to her. In fact, survey after survey shows that most women do not report or officially complain about incidences of sexual harassment. But that doesn't mean they aren't experiencing it in epidemic numbers. Even though it is almost 30 years since the start of the contemporary women's movement, we have astoundingly high reports of sexual harassment. Follow these a second. In the military, more than 60% of the women in a 1988 survey reported some form of sexual harassment. The federal workforce, in a major 1987 study, 42% of women federal workers said they had experienced. Military academies, recent surveys show that more than 60% at West Point alone had been subjected to some form of sexual harassment. Tailhook, can we forget it? The Defense Department's Inspector General's report says at least 90 indecent assaults took place, and that there was evidence that Tailhook 91 was, are you ready? Tame in comparison to earlier conventions. On Capitol Hill, a Washington Post survey done after the Packwood story found that 1 in 3 women said she had been harassed by a co-worker or supervisor or member of Congress. 1 in 9 said they'd been harassed by a member of Congress. News media, following the Thomas Hill hearings, a University of Maryland survey of women working out of the congressional press galleries found that more than 60% of the 102 women surveyed said sexual harassment had been a problem for them. And by the way, only 8% of them thought they were treated equally in their places of work, equally with men. Lawyers, a study in the National Law Journal found that 60% of the 3,000 women attorneys at the top 250 U.S. law firms had experienced sexual harassment. School children, sexual harassment appears to be rampant. In a study that was recently released by Wellesley College and 17 magazine, 89% of the girls reported receiving suggestive gestures, looks, comments, or jokes. 83% reported being touched, pinched, or grabbed. 39% received unwanted attention on a daily basis. 29% said they received it once a week. If sexual harassment were a virus affecting men in these numbers, it would be declared an epidemic, worthy of a White House or congressional commission. What is going on here? How can we explain such a prevalence of sexual abuse at a time when women are supposed to be more liberated than ever before? Think about it. This is a form of sex discrimination that is not only hard to prove, but is drastically underreported because it is usually accompanied by shame, self-doubting, and most important, psychologists tell me, silence. What makes sex harassment such a devastating form of sex discrimination and such a successful tactic on the part of men who want to put women down is this: lewd comments and unwanted groping goes to the core of a woman's being. The behavior is directed specifically at a woman's sexuality as a way of defining her as an object, undermining her self-esteem and confidence, diminishing her value in the workplace, limiting her options in life, and giving the harasser control. Psychologists tell me that harassment is primarily about power. When it comes to men in powerful positions, Dr. Stiver calls it the Watergate mentality, a sense of arrogance and entitlement. Harassment, says Harvard's Dr. Judith Jordan, is a way of disempowering and silencing, she says. It's a way of saying, you may have an important job, you may think you're smart, but I still have the power in this situation. And one of the ways I can exercise my power is by making you feel uncomfortable. I can make you feel how dependent you are on me for a job. I am in the driver's seat. And because the dominant group, which happens to be men in this society, have defined male reality as the reality, she says, women aren't believed. They are told they're too sensitive. They're told they're fantasizing. This pattern, Dr. Jordan told me, is the hallmark of all forms of abuse against women, whether it's battering, rape, incest, or harassment. She says, you create shame, you create doubt, you create embarrassment, and lo and behold, women don't speak up. And this serves to reinforce an existing male power structure. And so, says Dr. Jordan, silencing is a powerful weapon of oppression. And as for those who do find their voices, who do speak out, Dr. Jordan says that every time a woman moves from silence to finding her own voice, she is subject to a vigorous attempt to discredit her and to shut her up. Remember what they said about Anita Hill. She was fantasizing, a victim of erotomanic delusional disorder. She was a vengeful woman who combed The Exorcist, looking for details to concoct her story. She was a man-hater, a perjurer. And in the case of Senator Packwood, well, he also used one of the oldest tricks in the patriarchal book. He trotted out the old double standard and tried to discredit and intimidate some of the women and stop the story. He faxed us mean-spirited statements about, and I emphasize, purported aspects of several women's private consensual sexual histories, and these statements were written by current and former staffers. The statement said nothing about any of the specific incidents, and I must say his tactic almost worked. At one point, some of the women he tried to discredit pulled out of the story, which certainly weakened our story, to say the least. Women who had told us much more serious stories were not going to allow us to use either the stories or their names in the paper. So we really needed these women to have a publishable story. More than one of these women likened it to blackmail. The implicit threat some of these women said they felt was this: you continue to cooperate with the Post and I will embarrass you by releasing these statements publicly. In the end, however, they were brave women and they're courageous women, and they said, we won't bow to this kind of pressure. Count us in. Not to say that they didn't remember Anita Hill and worry that the system would fail them. Dr. Jordan told me that the failure of the system in all of our institutions, whether it's schools, churches, or the Congress, the failure to take this issue seriously is again a hallmark of sexual harassment and all forms of abuse against women. As far as we know, the Packwood case is the first time in history the Senate has ever officially considered a case of sexual misconduct. And for all you Kennedy School students, this has a very important public policy angle. This is a social and political issue that affects strikingly large numbers of people in this country, but one that has historically not been taken very seriously by our elected officials. We all know that Congress has been the last holdout in making its members accountable for sexual harassment. To get an even better sense of how lack of seriousness with which they take this issue, ponder this. The last figures I have show that some 40% of members of Congress have not signed a statement circulated by the Capitol Hill Women's Political Caucus saying they won't tolerate sexual harassment in their offices. Non-signers include a recent presidential candidate, Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, and Democratic leader Senator Bill Bradley. Several members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, including Strom Thurmond and Orrin Hatch. Not signing, I guess is a good way to send a message that, we don't think this is very important. Dr. Judith Jordan suggests one reason that the system doesn't take sex harassment more seriously is that on some level, all men benefit from the fear that women feel. Fear keeps them vulnerable. It keeps women in a constant state of disequilibrium. It keeps women silent. Fear limits women's options, and it cuts down on men's competition. Feminist author Marilyn French has pointed out that as a matter of fact, most women live in a constant state of fear. It influences where women live, where they shop, where they work, the hours they go out. She says, and I quote, listen to this a second, "Women are afraid in a world in which almost half the population bears the guise of the predator, in which no factor, age, dress, or color, distinguishes a man who will harm a woman from one who will not." So what's the solution, gang? Is there hope? Well, that's what we want to talk about today. We want to explore some of the many aspects of this, and Marty, in particular, I think, has hope. So right now I'm going to ask Marty Langeland to talk to you for a few minutes, try to get our terms straight and talk to you about what is sexual harassment, both the legal, there's legal sexual harassment, as she'll tell you, and there's illegal sexual harassment as defined by the law. Marty.
Thank you, Florence. Can everybody hear me? Is this mic working okay? Well, as Florence mentioned, I'm a self-defense instructor. I'm not Miss Manners. And sexual harassment is not about hurting women's dainty, delicate feelings. It's about power abuse. It's about ethics. It's about civil liberties in the sense not just of women's right to do their jobs unmolested without having to watch over their shoulder for, Larry the Lech in the office or for a senator who's coming down the hallway at them, but also our simple civil right to walk down a public street without being molested, to sit in a public park, eat lunch, to be on the subway and not have our butt grabbed. Harassment is something that doesn't just occur on the job. The legal definition began 20 years ago with an employment definition, all right? And the law recognized first two kinds of illegal sex discrimination harassment. The first is called quid pro quo harassment, this for that, and it means a situation where a boss says to a woman employee, if you want this job, this promotion, this plum assignment, you'd better put out baby, or requires her to provide other sexual services short of actual intercourse. Right? The second form, after quid pro quo, is actually far more common. It's called hostile environment harassment. The law recognizes that a constant barrage of comments, physical contact that's unwelcome, unwanted, pornography being displayed in the workforce, other kinds of behaviors that are designed really to disempower women, to let women get a message loud and clear, you are not on your own turf here, you're not welcome here. That hostile environment harassment is actually much more common. And it is created at every level. It's created by the guys at West Point who don't think women should be officers. It's created by the construction workers who drive that first woman carpenter or plumber or electrician off the job site. It's created in stock brokerages, right, where you don't want that woman to become a stockbroker in your office, and so you harass her life until she's miserable. Right? It also occurs in academia, right? And women very quickly extended the employment definition of sex harassment as illegal discrimination into the academic field. A professor who says, baby, you want an A in this class? Meet me afterwards, right, is doing the same kind of extortion, sexual extortion, that the boss is when he says, if you want a job, you need to put out. Right? And then women took it one more step, right, because again, it's not just happening on the job or in academia. Right? Women began looking at their landlords. Many, many women, including I'm sure many in our audience, have had the experience of a building manager or landlord, right, saying, oh, I can't fix your plumbing, you haven't been nice enough to me. Right? If you don't want the rent increase, you'd better put out. We're talking about extortion. That's the word for it, extortion. Sexual extortion happens in housing as well, and in the last few years we've had some landmark settlements and lawsuits where women have sued their landlords for that kind of sexual extortion. Those are the three areas where the law now recognizes that women's right to integrity, physical as well as psychological integrity, are being violated by sexual predators: education, employment, and housing. But as every woman in this audience knows, those aren't the only areas it happens. I ask women in my self-defense classes, how old were you the first time you were harassed? And I ask them by boys in the neighborhood, right? Boys on the school bus. You know what the average age for the beginning of harassment for women in our culture is? It's not 15 or 16 years old. 6 to 8, sometimes as early as age 4, women remember severe, memorable incidences of harassment by boys in the neighborhood. Right? I ask the question of women in my classes, and we're talking thousands of women a year here. Right? How old were you the first time you were seriously harassed by adult male strangers? Right? Want to guess? Age 10 or 11, pre-puberty. 10 and 11-year-olds are already getting the message in our society that they don't have a right to walk past a construction site or through a park or just down the block in their own neighborhoods, right, without being victims, without being treated as if female was equivalent to victim. Well, I'm sick and tired of women as victims. I think a lot of women are sick and tired of being treated as victims, having to respond as victims. I think it's time women stopped putting up with this. Let's talk about some of the definitions women have come up with apart from the legal definitions, ways to define what's really happening in our life from the age of 6 or 8, 10 or 11, right on through our 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. 80-year-old women have told me that they vary their paths, where they wait for the bus, where they walk, the hours they go to the supermarket, to avoid harassers at 80, just like they had to do when they were 8. In D.C., we use a definition from the African American Women's Committee for Community Education. Sexual harassment is the use of words, gestures, bodily actions, or other means of verbal and nonverbal communication to insult, degrade, intimidate, humiliate, and otherwise dehumanize women. It's about power. The unions define harassment as an issue of workers' rights. Sexual harassment, they say, isn't just a personal threat. It's economic blackmail. It's not flattering. It's not your fault. It's against the law. The definition I personally think is most general comes from the National Council for Research on Women. They characterize harassment at its core as the inappropriate sexualization of an otherwise non-sexual relationship or interaction, an assertion by men, by the male harassers, and again, not all men harass, right? An assertion by harassers of the primacy of a woman's sexuality over her role as a worker, a professional colleague, a student, or a simple person in our community. That definition clearly applies on the job and in academia. But in fact, a man who yells, "Hey baby, give me some ass," at a stranger on the street is doing the same thing. It's an involuntary sexualization of what should be a perfectly ordinary interaction, two strangers passing on a public sidewalk. He is turning it into a sexual encounter within which there is also an embedded threat. Right? And that threat comes because of rape testing. That's a term that people may not be familiar with. We know at rape crisis centers around the country that a significant number of rapists begin with harassment. They use harassment very cold-bloodedly to select their targets. They may stand too close to one woman at a bus stop or make an inappropriate comment about another woman's anatomy on the street to see who in the area is going to react strongly and assertively to defend her ground and who is going to be intimidated. Rapists don't look for a fair fight. They're looking for easy targets, women they can intimidate, women who won't fight back in an assault. And we now have rape testing rapists out there using harassment very cold-bloodedly as a predator sizes up his prey. Because of that, being passive in the face of harassment is very dangerous, and we'll talk later about what to do. But I think those definitions give you a feel for what women are thinking and women are doing about this problem. It is certainly not invisible anymore. I thank Anita Hill. I thank all the Packwood women, and the many, many other women who have stepped forward to use both legal and direct action tactics to stop this behavior. It's a social practice, and all social practices are learned. They can be changed.
Great. Thank you, Marty, very much. Next, I'm going to ask Julie Williamson, the Portland political consultant, to talk about her experiences in terms of being one of the women who talked to us, who was used in the first story that we did about Senator Packwood, and also to generalize that experience and to show you what you can learn from that. Julie?
All right. Thank you, Florence. I'll have to admit to a bit of discomfort every time I hear myself described as a Packwood woman.
Fair enough.
But victim doesn't seem real good either, so it is very hard to find terms that work. I'd like to tell you why it's hard to speak out and why it's worth it. My experience in 1969 happened while I was an aide, a secretary scheduler for Senator Packwood in his office in Oregon shortly after he was elected to the U.S. Senate. I'd known him casually for a long time, served as a volunteer on his Senate campaign in '68, and then been hired onto his campaign staff, and then he hired me for his Senate staff. I was alone in the office on a Thursday afternoon, about 2, on the phone. He had come back to Oregon from a Washington trip. I had not seen him yet, walked into the office, walked up behind me while I was on the phone, and kissed me on the back of the neck. I was shaken, and my first thing was I had to get finished with that phone call, and when I hung up, I turned around and said, "Don't you ever do that again." I then walked away from him into another office that was a dead-end office, turned to realize he was following me. Something told me I was in trouble, and we had a little skirmish where I tried to get out of the office, and I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. It's like some kind of cartoon of the boss chasing the secretary around the desk or something. I couldn't get away. Eventually, he grabbed me. At that time, I was trying to kick him, and so he stood on my feet, pulled my head back by the hair, gave me a big, awful, disgusting kiss, and at the same time was, with his other hand, reaching up under my dress and trying to pull down the girdle that I had on to hold up my hose. I kept struggling and got away, and that was the genesis of the problem. I ran into the front office. I was standing there kind of frantically figuring out, do I grab my purse, do I run, what do I do next? When he stalked out past me, stopped at the threshold into the hall and said, "If not today, someday." I quit soon thereafter. The difficulty for me in speaking out, first of all, was that this happened in 1969, and when I was contacted, I did not know that this had been going on since then and that many, many other women had been affected. Once that was determined, I said, if there are other women who are willing to speak up, who have more current situations, I will stand with them. And that's what I've tried to do. I also did not know, when I agreed to speak out about this, that it would become a national issue. At the time I was contacted, there was an election in process, and I thought that this issue would develop before the election, and the voters of Oregon would then be informed about their senator and have an opportunity when they voted to vote with that knowledge. Unfortunately, the story couldn't be completed in time and was not completed until November 22nd. However, Packwood was contacted before the election with my name and I believe the names of 5 others who had agreed to allow their names to be used to tell, so that the Post could confront him with the allegations that we were making about him. There was then a period of time between the time on, I believe, October 29th, he knew for sure that I was one of the women that was ready to speak out about him, and the time the story was published, where Packwood attempted, I believe, to cause me to withdraw, and for a while was successful. I perhaps foolishly believed that I was safe. I'm 54 years old, I'm a grandmother, my family understood and supported me, I have a successful business with a terrific history of helping candidates win elections, and I think the respect of my clients, and I get my business word of mouth. And I thought, I can afford to do this. I'm in a place in my life where I can stand up with all of the women who are younger than me, who also, I can support them, I can do this, I'm strong. What I didn't expect was to be blackmailed about things in my life that have nothing to do with Senator Bob Packwood, but that I would find less than pleasant to read in the paper. I did not expect my business to be affected, and it has been significantly affected by this. I think sometimes because friends of Bob Packwood have said to potential clients, and at one case, and an actual client who's told me about some of his experiences, if you work with Julie Williamson, you know, it's probably going to cost you a lot of contributions, that sort of thing. And you know, if a client has a chance to hire a political consultant without kind of baggage attached, or one who doesn't have that kind of baggage, some choose not to hire me. I hope that will right itself when this is done. It's hard because it's a kind of an odd thing to sit up and tell all of you about. It feels very personal, and yet I think it is very important to do it. I think this code of silence has kept young people from knowing what their appropriate boundaries might be, has kept women from verifying each other's experiences, and certainly until I spoke out, I had no idea how many other women that I knew had been subjected to situations in their lives that were similar and also felt they had no recourse. It's worth it mostly because of an anecdote I'll tell you, and I always have to take a breath before I tell it because I get a little tearful about it sometimes. I came home one day, listened to my answering machine, and had an anonymous call from a woman who identified herself as the mother of a young teenager, I think about 13 years old, and they had just come home from a grand jury situation where this girl and 10 of her schoolmates had brought charges against one of their teachers that had resulted in 13 counts, I think you call it, against him for sexual misconduct and sexual harassment of these young girls in the schoolroom. And she was thanking me for speaking out, because these girls began to talk to their families about what was happening to them in their classroom when they read and heard about what was going on with Senator Packwood. Then they suddenly knew that what was going on in their classroom was wrong too. And I think that's the example we really have to set in order to change what's going on for young women in this country and for the future, for our children and grandchildren. I want to take this forward. I want to participate in open hearings. I think want is too strong a word. I think that the appropriate thing would be for there to be open hearings so that the public has a right to judge for itself the people making the charges against Senator Packwood and the content of those charges and the appropriateness of whatever decision the Ethics Committee makes about Senator Packwood's future. I think that open hearings will be very difficult. But I think it is the right thing, and I hope we get to pursue this to that next stage.
Thank you, Julie, very much. Next, Gina Hutton is going to tell us about her experience and also show how there's another pattern that sometimes accompanies cases of sexual harassment, and it's, you know, it's one of the terms from alcoholism, an enabler. Gina was an enabler. Just kidding, Gina. But a brave one. Gina Hutton.
Oh, thank you, Florence. Yes, I've been asked to tell this story from a little different perspective this time, and that's from the perspective of an enabler. I've talked about this story for the last several days, and it's been okay. I could pretty much keep a distance from that aspect of it. But I feel that it is important to look at that part of it, what I did to help this man and to protect him. Because it's a lot about how we're trained as women. And I think it's the place, it's one of the first places that we have to educate ourselves to change, that it's okay for us to be something other than an object. So this story began for me back in 1980 when I responded to a letter put out by Gloria Steinem soliciting funds for Senator Packwood because of his pro-choice stand. And I responded to the letter. They had my name. They talked to me for a while over the phone and then asked me to be his chairperson for Lane County in Oregon. And I accepted. It sounded like an incredible opportunity and a great challenge because I'm not political. And so this was in late 1979. By the end of winter, the beginning of spring of 1980, the campaign was starting to pick up. I went out to the Red Lion to meet Senator Packwood's DC chair, who is Mimi Wayforth, and she was to say, yes, you're okay, you're great, or not. So I was sitting there with Senator Packwood, and Mimi came in, and we met. She left. The senator and I talked, and he said he wanted to get to know who I was then. So I wanted to let him know who I was, so I brought out all my pictures of my kids and my cats and the important things politically that you would want to know. And after a bit, it was time to go. So he said that he would walk me to the car. So I said, thank you, that's great. We walked out there, and I was getting into the car when he reached around and grabbed me and pulled me in close and put his arms around me and put one of those kisses on my face with the wandering tongue. And it was all fast, and I stopped him from doing this, but when I stopped him, my first thought was, he can't do this here. Here. He can't. Somebody's going to see him. There could be press. There could be cameras. I mean, his reputation. What about his wife? So I thought nothing about myself. I thought, okay, this is a crisis situation. I have to get him out of here. I said, Senator, get in my car. I will take you home. So he got in the car. I put him in. I shut the door. I'm driving him with great protection to his room where he will be safe. But he's inviting me into his room on the way. And I was like, no, how do I, so this is great. I haven't had to retell this from exactly this place. I am going, oh my goodness, how am I going to tell him no without hurting his feelings. How am I going to do this tactfully so he can maintain his ego, so it will all be intact when this is over, and he will not feel bad about himself? I did it. I did it great. And he got out of the car and left in one piece. I drove away and made it to the highway before I stopped in tears because I couldn't see to drive any farther, going, what was that? What happened? You know, I thought that I was being called upon to work with this person because of my capabilities, what they saw that I could do, how I could front run for this man, how I could speak out on his behalf. And I felt suddenly reduced to an object, and it was extremely painful. I was humiliated and embarrassed, and I had to go back and work with this person the next day. How would I do that? What was I going to say to him when I saw him? Would he say something to me? So I spent the night trying to come to grips with that, and went back the next morning and put on my very best. This is it. We're not doing this anymore. And I did. When I looked at him, that was the look that I was able to communicate, and that's what happened. Since then, well, actually, from then on, I put this story away. I shared it with a few people, but mostly inside of myself, I put it away. I put away the feeling of embarrassment and the humiliation, and I put away the thought that there was anything I could ever do about it. Of course there was nothing I could do about it. What would I do other than tell a couple of my friends? Go to the press? Right. So this got put away until one day a friend of mine called and said, have you read the paper? No, I haven't read the paper. Well, read it, Gina. There are people who have stood up and they're telling your story. So I read it, and then was faced with having to dip inside and get the courage to stand up and join the women who stood up and spoke out. And that's how I met Florence.
Wow.
Yes. So one other thing that I just want to say on this is that most of the people in my immediate family have been supportive, but not everyone. And I've had to face older members of my family, my close family, who have said to me, are you sure, can you really say this? Are you sure you didn't seduce him somehow? Think about when you were sitting at that table with him. Didn't you sort of look at him in a way that would, flirt or something like that? Come on, be truthful. And you're just in this for the publicity. You're just in this to get out there and so that you can join the bandwagon, so to speak. Those are painful comments also. But that's a very old school. It's an old guard way to think about this. And those are things that we have to step out and beyond, because this is an important issue, and we have a window of opportunity to change it, to learn about it ourselves, me, how to stop enabling, and my children get to watch this. It's my job to model for them. They're 19 and 20 years old. So here I am to share this with you, and hope that we can raise a consciousness a bit about this and make a difference with abuse of power. We can stop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you've gotten the point that so often we've been cast and women have taken and accepted and been pushed into and forced into the role of victim. Marty, however, is a self-defense expert, an expert in this whole area, and she's going to give suggestions about how women can fight back and some very helpful suggestions.
Thank you, Florence. One of the things I did at the Rape Crisis Center after Anita Hill testified was begin a project that involved asking women across the United States, all races, all classes, all regions, all ages, have you ever stopped a harasser anywhere, on the job, at school, on the street, on the bus, anywhere in your community? Have you ever stopped a harasser? If so, what did you do? What works? We teach a class in Washington called Confronting Harassers with some of the techniques that work. And I want to just run through very quickly here some of the things that we know do work. Women's typical responses to harassers are culturally, we're trained to be passive. We're trained to do all the things that Julie and Gina have talked about, to keep the silence, to actually protect the harasser. We have many, many cases of women apologizing to their harasser when he intrudes on their space. Women say, excuse me, say, oh, it must be my fault. The single most common reaction of women of all social classes to harassment on the street, on the job, everywhere, is appeasement, the silence, ignore it, pretend it was a joke, pretend he doesn't mean it. Oh, he must have meant something else. I must have misinterpreted, I must be wrong, that couldn't really be a hand on my butt. And if it is a hand on my butt, I must have invited it, what did I do? All the doubt that Florence was talking about, all the experiences that Gina and Julie have talked about, women go through that routinely. They go through that with the crudest, most disgusting street harassers that they've never seen before. It must be my fault. Those construction workers said that to me. Women blame themselves, and they do, on the surface, keep silence. That silence appeasement response is very, very common. It's also totally ineffective. Being passive does not stop this. In fact, it plays right into the harasser's dominant scenario, right, his control scenario. He's intimidated his victim. Right? If he's a predatory harasser, he may intimidate her all the way into bed. Right? Or if he's a dominant harasser, he's just getting his ego jollies. If he's a strategic harasser, he may intimidate her right off the job. Right? It's about power. So we know being passive doesn't work. Being silent doesn't work. Right? Some women, a minority, are taught what we call the FY response. Right? I'm sure you all know what that stands for. Right? To get right back in the harasser's face, be as crude and abusive as he is, be as vulgar as possible. Right? That's an aggressive reaction. That also does not work well. It tends to escalate and can escalate very quickly because of the extent of male ego involved in sexual extortion and harassment. The third option that women have traditionally used is avoidance, right? All right, they tried ignoring it or pretending it was a joke. That didn't stop him. They yelled back something incredibly crude. That just encouraged him and made him even more determined to conquer, right? They quit. They leave the job. Right? They sometimes leave their apartment if the landlord is the harasser. They may leave their congregation if the minister is the harasser. They may drop out of school if the professor is the harasser. The social and economic costs of this are not minor. Not minor. Women lose far more than the right to stroll through a park on a sunny afternoon. Women lose careers, jobs, the right to religion, the right to housing. All of our basic civil liberties are at risk when harassers strike. So what works? With harassers who, quote, really didn't mean it, assertiveness is almost always enough. If the guy really is just one of the old dinosaurs who doesn't quite get it yet, you can say, you know, Mr. Jones, you are 2 inches from me. I don't like it, back off right now. Nicely, politely, in a ladylike fashion, be assertive. When you do A, I feel B, and I want you to do C from now on. When you call me Toots, I feel trivialized, use my name from now on. Very simple formula, assertiveness works great. When the guy means it, assertiveness doesn't work because, of course, he wants you to feel intimidated or trivialized or whatever. Right? Confrontation is stronger, and I want to give you an example. I can't teach a confrontation class in 5 minutes, but I can give you an example of a confrontation. True story from Washington, D.C., one of the many stories in the book. Picture a woman on a crowded bus, a hot July afternoon. Right? Many of us have had the experience of Mr. Hands grabbing our rear end on the bus, fondling a breast on the bus when you're crowded, jammed in the aisle. Women usually are passive and evasive. They sidle away. So, for example, if I'm standing behind Julie and I'm getting grabbed, and I sidle in front of her, now whose rear end is on the line? Have I done her a favor? No. All right? I have not solved this problem. I have simply substituted one victim for another. Right? Women are sometimes aggressive. They'll turn around and belt the harasser. Right? This is not appropriate either. What this woman did was a confrontation. I think this one example will give you a sense of the flavor of this kind of new social change mechanism. Picture the bus, jammed pack to pack, shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. A woman reaches behind her and grabs the harasser's hand and arm off of her rear end. She holds his arm up in the air, and in a nice, clear, calm, commanding voice, she says, "What was this hand doing on my ass?" Then she holds it up there. This woman has accomplished a number of things in one moment. She has identified the harasser. He has no longer got the protection of privacy or anonymity. Right? There he is. She's got a sleeve. Right? Everybody knows that hand was exactly where she said it was. Number two, she has created an incentive for this harasser. It is no longer a risk-free game for this man. Suddenly, there are some social penalties applied for this behavior that has been his little psychosexual thrill, his little power game. Right? He, in fact, turned beet red and jumped off the bus at the first stop. Could not get off that bus fast enough. She also did some community education. She gave every woman watching, and there was a packed bus, a lot of women on that bus, right, a new set of skills, a new tool, a new way to react that was not passive and victimized and helpless and internalizing all that anger, and was also not aggressive and ugly, but was simply very self-respecting, very strong, very truthful. Right? The confrontation techniques that we teach are based on self-defense principles and also nonviolent social change principles. The book is full of wonderful stories. I'd like to share one more technique that involves using allies. On the job, there's assertiveness, confrontation. There's also group confrontations, which are very powerful. But sometimes just the simple use of allies can stop a persistent harasser. And I'm going to ask Liz to help me demonstrate this one. This is a physical technique. Many harassers, of course, are physical harassers. It's not just verbal. We had in Washington, at a different agency, not my own, not DOT, okay, a very senior agency official, one of the top guys, who was a low-grade dominant harasser. He liked to assert ownership over the women in his territory, and he defined that to include all women who came within arm's reach of him. What this man did was a control gesture, not horrendous. He didn't French kiss anybody, but every woman who came in, he would do this controlling smell of the back, like, "How are you, Liz?" Right? This ownership touch, right? It wasn't quite grabbing her arm and hauling her away, but always the ownership touch. He did it with high-ranking women, he did it with low-ranking women. He did it with complete strangers. It was his way of asserting control, ownership over the men in his office. The women of all levels, 30 women, right, met with me. What could they do? They were afraid to say, "We don't like it when you put your hands on us. Keep your hand off us, please." Simple assertiveness. They certainly weren't ready to confront him with a stronger, more direct statement. What they did was a simple allies action. They agreed that the following Monday morning, right, they would all 30 of them begin to do the following physical action. When Mr. Power Hands put his hand on the small of their back, they would not break their sentence. They would continue talking, but they would reach back and throw the hand down. Just like that. Now, about that project we were working on, I want to talk. Throw the hand down. Now, this man was not stupid. He was a high government official. It only took 30 women 2 days to retrain him. And he stopped a pattern of behavior that had been annoying, not seriously threatening, but annoying all the women that he came near for years. I would encourage women to think about direct action strategies. The book is full of them. One of my other favorites is the Confrontation Survey, and I want to end with that, but we may be able to come back to more of them. I use this a lot with street harassers and also with low-key dominance harassers on the job. The appendix in the back of the book has what we use in Washington as our Confrontation Survey. I want you to picture your average street harasser goes, "Ooh, mama, ooh, baby, nice legs, whatever." Okay? And you whip out of your purse this one-page survey, and you say, "That's very interesting. You've just harassed a woman. Women are doing research on sexual harassment. I have some questions for you. Now, was that ooh, 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 baby? I want to get your exact words down. 3 oohs, right? How many times today have you said that to a woman or girl? How old were you when you began saying that to women and girls? What else do you say to women on the street? Do you comment on other parts of our bodies? Do you harass all kinds of women or only some kinds of women? How old are you now?" The harasser falls apart. It is fun. It is truly fun. You are not acting like a victim. When you whip out that survey, suddenly you're back in control of the interaction. You're completely violating his expectations about how this little scenario is going to go down. You are not doing what you're supposed to do. And at the same time, he can't escalate it because you're not being rude. You're not calling him any names. You're simply saying, "Now, tell me why you do this. Why do you think men do this? What do you think women should do?" The guys fall apart. I wish I had a photo of the looks on men's faces when I confront them with the Confrontation Survey. And the answers they give are amazing. Some are incredibly stupid and self-serving, and some are really insightful. Some men know exactly why they do it. Others haven't a clue. I would encourage you to talk about creative remedies, nonviolent remedies, and to think about what you can do to be allies, right? And I'd like to close with one final note. There's a whole chapter in the book of stories from men as allies. What we are finding is that men who are good guys are finally figuring out what to do. Men who confront a rape joke, who turn to their buddy and say, Jack, that joke's not funny to me either. It's not just that Sally or Shirley doesn't like it, I don't like it. Speaking as a man confronting a harasser on behalf of men's views changing, it's extremely powerful. That also surprises harassers no end. It's really quite amazing when a man speaks up. And I was delighted to hear enough stories of men who actually intervened and spoke up and did the right thing that we could put a whole chapter in a book about it. 2 years ago, I don't think we would have had those stories. I'm delighted that we have them now. So I encourage men to think about their power as allies. The more sexist the man, the more powerful it is when he hears from another man that his behavior is out of line. Guys, you're not helpless here either.
Great. Thank you, Marty. All of these women will take questions in just a few minutes. They wanted to get to Liz McKenna, who is a lawyer. And if these kinds of strategies don't work, maybe you want to take the legal route, or, Liz, maybe you don't. What's involved?
Well, I think perhaps my approach involves, I think, more power. I do have to just share with you one story that Marty has reminded me of, and it was something that I realized I was using one of her techniques long ago when I was first a law clerk back in 1977. I clerked for a federal judge, and I would hold pretrial conferences, and sometimes I conducted them. And there was one attorney who constantly called me honey. Now, I was in the position essentially of a judge at that point. And I finally, after one of the conferences, went up to him and said, if you want to have any further communication with this court or with me, you will not address me as honey. He was so astounded. I know he's told that story to other people. He has never called me honey since then, and I think it's spread a little. Now, this was in the South, but it happens in other parts of the country also. I think that one of the things that you have to think about in terms of law is that you do have some additional authority. It's not just taking a chance, and I think the things you've recommended are wonderful, but you can have real power. You can get judgments, big judgments sometimes, against individuals. You can get judgments against companies. You can make them sorry that they didn't do the things that they needed to do. You can embarrass them, particularly when it's somebody high up in the company. When someone comes into me, I look at several options, and if you think about coming in, and I encourage you, if you can't stop the situation, or even if you haven't tried one of Marty's techniques, talk to a lawyer. Most lawyers, I'm a plaintiff's lawyer, and you should be going to a plaintiff's lawyer, and you should be going to an employment specialist if it's an employment situation, to a housing specialist if it's a housing situation. You shouldn't be just going to somebody who does personal injury, because this is a very specialized area. But most lawyers will talk with you for 15 minutes or so free, and they'll tell you some of your options. And you ought to call and find out, and call before you quit your job. Call before you punch the guy out. Call before you've destroyed the evidence or destroyed your opportunity to create evidence. I can tell you I had a woman walk in the other day, and we talked about the situation. She said, I can't go back to work. This guy has been coming into my office, fondling me. And I just, he started to touch me in places I really don't want him to touch me in. And I don't know what to do. And I finally broke down and told my husband about it. And now he doesn't want me to go back to work. I said, let's get a tape recorder out. In Oregon, it happens to be legal to tape record a phone conversation. She called him up, told him why she couldn't come in, and he made some wonderful, wonderful confessions about, I really did want you to come away for the weekend with me so we could sit in the hot tub and drink champagne. Now, he's married, she's married. This was clearly a situation where he was trying to have a relationship with her. And in fact, the invitation for the champagne had come at the same time he was giving her a raise. And if anybody doesn't see the relationship with that, they're blind. But in any event, we can sometimes get evidence at the very beginning. I look at other options like criminal cases, filing a criminal charge against someone. Many of the incidents that occurred with Senator Packwood are not just sexual harassment. They are sexual assault. They are sexual misconduct. some of them constitute criminal action or could. And so you need to consider that. Now, I don't usually like that option because my major focus is my client. And putting the guy in jail doesn't do a lot for my client. It may make her feel good, and I'm concerned about that. But it doesn't compensate her. And in fact, sometimes it cuts the guy off from his job so he has no money to pay if in fact we get a judgment against him. So it's not my first option. There are other possibilities, considering filing a workers' comp claim. You're injured on the job. If we can show that it's related to the job, the activities, he brings you in and requires some sort of sexual favor in exchange for a good performance review or whatever, workers' comp claims have sometimes been accepted, sometimes without question. I like that because then it makes it pretty clear that the employer is more likely to be liable. Sometimes we can just negotiate some kind of remedy. I've had situations where we've been able to work out a good remedy, allow the individual to go back to work even. And I'll talk about remedies a little later, but there are times that we just want to go in and say to the employer, you're not running your office the way you should. You don't have a policy, you haven't done any training, you are really exposed here. And all my client wants to do is to get your office in line and quit the harassment. And so she wants her job, she likes her job, it's her whole life. You know, she's got 17 years in the job and she's got a great build-up in terms of her pension, etc. She doesn't want to leave this job. She just wants to be able to work in a professional, peaceful manner and not have to worry every day when she goes into work whether she's going to be harassed. Sometimes I go to the union. If there's a union involved, they sometimes can be helpful. Sometimes we have to go to administrative procedures through the company, but I think most of those are useless because they just develop defenses for the company, and I don't usually find those helpful. The major step that you take with almost all of these is you go through the administrative process, either the EEOC or the state agency, and in virtually every state, if you file with one, you're filing with the other. That's important for two reasons. One, again, you develop some facts. You might get some good statements from the other side. But secondly, in terms of the federal law, you're required to at least file with the EEOC in order to get what are additional and very favorable remedies that have been enacted in the new Civil Rights Act of 1991. Now, I say they're favorable. They're not great, but they're a whole lot better than what you could get currently under many of the state laws. That is, you can now, under the federal laws, get compensation for pain and suffering. You sometimes can get punitive damages, which punish the company. And one of the ways you determine how to punish the company is you look at how much they take in every year and ask for 20 or, I don't know, 30% or whatever you think it will take. At least you can put that in your complaint. You ask for what it will take to make them see that they can't keep operating this way. Now, it's not so easy. I mean, I make it sound easy. There are lots of options, lots of claims you can file. Sometimes we file a false imprisonment claim if you've been restrained in a room like Julie was. Sometimes we file assault and battery if they've actually assaulted an individual. It's easy to file. It's not so easy to pursue it and to win. When a client comes in, I tell them, look, I need to know you are here for the long haul. I need to know you're willing to commit the time, because we're talking about 1 or 2 years to get to trial, 1 or 2 years after that to get to appeal. It's a long haul. You're also talking about commitment in terms of emotions. You are going to have to involve other people, your family sometimes. I may want your children to testify or your husband to testify about the emotional impact this has had on you. Sometimes you're going to have to involve friends, and you personally are going to have to go through a lot of scrutiny. We're going to look at your lives, and we're going to look at your medical history. If we're asking for compensatory damages, we have to look at your entire medical history, or at least they're going to go back 10 years or so to make sure that there wasn't something else that was going on in your life that could account for this pain and suffering or emotional injury that we're talking about right now. I often will, in fact, if you're not seeing a therapist, will recommend you see someone at least to determine the injury. We're finding a lot of individuals suffer ultimately from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. It's something we saw from the people who were in Vietnam, where we're seeing it, and it often takes about 6 months before you really are seeing the symptoms of it. But if somebody's been attacked on the job, it may be several months down the line before we really experience or understand the full impact of what has occurred. And sometimes it takes many years to get over that also. Finally, you have to consider commitment in terms of money. Most people who walk into the office do not have $75,000 or $100,000 or $200,000, and that's what I estimate it is going to take to litigate that case, at least in terms of my time. Now, obviously, if it's a good case, and we screen them very carefully, but we will take it on a contingency basis. But you still are going to have to pay, to some extent, the costs along the way. Law firms aren't supposed to advance costs. It also is important in terms of showing me your commitment that I get some money from you. So it does mean some sort of commitment. Last question, is it worth it? Yeah, I think it's worth it. I think the fact that you can have a court say, yes, this happened, is so important. I have a case now that it's so tragic. It was a woman who was deaf, who was working for the federal government. And this person, she was on a night shift, and her supervisor was really the only interpreter she had in the whole place. He spoke sign language because his parents were deaf. And he started forcing her to give him oral sex at night. And it was basically, he'd call her off the floor to say, I want you to do copying. I'll make it easier. It's tedious. They sort mail, actually. It was with the Postal Service. And she'd come off the floor, and then he had access to all of the rooms. He was the key supervisor. He was the head person for the night shift. And they'd lock her in a room, and if she did this, then things would be okay. She was so frightened she couldn't tell anyone. She thought her husband would divorce her. She didn't know what to do. After the first time, she was so trapped. She just, she said, first I thought if I just do it and get out of there, I'd be okay. And then after that, she was trapped. And it was tragic. She tried to commit suicide during that period of time. Finally, she came forward. And she went through an administrative process. Post office tried to fire this guy. The administrative process said, well, gee, we can't really tell who to believe, so they kept him on. And it took us going through a federal court trial with that ruling against us to finally show that she was telling the truth. But I can't tell you how happy she was. The look on her face when we won was worth everything. It said, you are telling the truth, a federal judge believes you, and they are going to award you not appropriate, not adequate damages, but the back pay for the time you lost, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that in itself is very important. There are other things you can do, creative things. I had a situation where, the woman was in the room and she was being groped. She was in a room with no windows in it. It was in a print shop. We got the manager, and this was through just a settlement before any trial or anything, we got them to cut a window in the room. Make it a window. I said, for safety purposes. It was very warm in the room. Probably was safe. Obviously, you also look for money. One other remedy that has worked in one case, and I think it's something to consider, is having a healing session. A session where we have a trained mediator. We have a trained mediator, and you have the harasser and the individual confront one another and say, when you do this, this is what happens. This is what I feel. And he said, well, why do you feel that way? And it was very successful. So there are lots of remedies, creative remedies, and it's a fun area of the law, and it is worth it. Please call a lawyer if you have a question, because they'll tell you whether you can go forward with it and whether you should.
And if not, call Marty.
That's right.
We'd like to take questions now. If you come to a microphone, if you have, didn't you have a question that you wanted to? No, you're all right? Anyone have questions?
We've answered all your questions.
You want to come to a microphone, please?
Can you relate the timing of the development of the story to the election process and tell me whether or not there was any conversation at the Post as to whether or not this should be published pre-election or whether that was just out of the question for logistical reasons?
I took the story to the Washington Post. I actually live in this area. And so I took it. It was a story that I had worked on initially for Vanity Fair, and we had a disagreement over a contract, and I continued working on it by myself, calling all of these people, and racking up quite a large phone bill of my own. And so I didn't take, eventually I had so much information, and I needed an outlet. And I had worked in Washington. I started Common Cause magazine, have done investigative reporting, and so had experience in investigative reporting, and took the story to them, and they essentially bought it. I mean, they hired me and paired me with Charlie Shepard, who is a wonderful investigative reporter as well. And so this was in October. And the election, as you may know, is the first week in November. Charlie and I worked as hard as we could, trying to nail this story down. We asked Senator Packwood's aide for an interview with the senator a week before they gave us an interview with the senator. And I believe they purposely we're trying to push the interview to as close to the election as possible. We interviewed him. We were out in Oregon. We interviewed him on a Thursday. He denied everything. He said, none of this, I don't know what you're talking about. None of these things, they're making them up. This is not plausible. It's, this is a political attack. It's my opponent. And even though we said, Senator, none of these women know each other. We found them. No one came to us. And the other thing that's important, that was an important part of the Packwood case, is that none of these women had officially complained, but all of them had told someone else. And so that's part of the way that the EEOC suggests that you corroborate stories. I mean, we were able to find people all over the country that they remembered that they had told at the time. And as I said to him and to his attorney, it's a little hard to think that we cooked this up, or that they cooked it up, since they don't even know each other. The bottom line is that he denied it totally, said it was a political attack. He began to fax this information, various pieces of information, to Post editor Lynn Downey. Charlie and I were out in Oregon in a hotel, working almost round the clock, trying to nail this story down, trying to tie all the ends up. And I really don't want to get into, there's some issues that involve sources that I can't really get into, but at some point, at a point, Saturday morning was the point, actually at about 5 or 6 Oregon time in the morning, that we finally decided we were not going to be able. I think Lynn Downey felt that you could not publish a story having to do with a public official running for election, that it was not fair to publish a story any later than the Sunday, which was with the election on Tuesday, and that there was more reporting that had to be done. In most of these cases, anyone who's in journalism knows that the reporters are usually way ahead of the editors on most stories. And there's a lag time in terms of bringing the editors up to date as to where, the entire situation. And I think reasonable people can argue about whether or not that story should have run before the election. I have to say that for reasons different from some of the Post editors, I probably would have made the same decision, in part because I think that some of these women's lives could have been ruined. And I don't think any woman's life was worth any story. But again, it was a very complicated, it wasn't that simple. It was a highly, fluid time. We had phones going back and forth to Washington, and the editors were, up late trying to make a decision about this.
I just wanted to add that I was called on Saturday morning and told that the story wasn't going to run. and I was depressed. And I figured I was probably going to get run over by a bus. But I got in my car and did what I do when I get really distracted and went out for a long drive by myself. And when I got back to the house about 2:30 in my office, the computer was on the screen was an open letter to the voters of Oregon. And it said, my wife and I are writing this letter so that you'll have this information, because this is what happened to her when she was 29 years old. And we think we're spending $10,000 to buy a full-page ad in the Oregonian to tell you this before the election. And it was all laid out there. And I thought, oh my God, you didn't. And I called him, I said, did you put this in the Oregonian? He said, no, it was already past the deadline. We couldn't get it in.
As I said, reasonable people can argue over that decision. I think, you know, many editors may have made a different decision. I'm not sure that they would have, and I can't go into some of the reasons why. Over here, you have a question?
I wonder if one of the panelists could either speak to or suggest some resources for some of the evolving definitions of sexual harassment. I think it seems like we've reached a place where everybody kind of goes, well, of course you can't make, you know, sexual overtures and things like that. But it seems like there's some more subtle kinds of harassment, which are a lot more common maybe, and equally problematic. And I'm very interested in knowing where I can find out more about that.
Thank you for that.
This is a superb book.
I do, in fact, ask women, you know, sort of how to handle some of the more low-key but very annoying and disempowering stuff that goes on. And there's lots of things you can do. One of the things I do is I do a lot of seminars for men's groups. I mean, I'm the only person I know who's ever done a sexual harassment seminar for 16-year-old boys in high school and for the Rotary and Moose Club. It's been a challenge. One of the things I do with guys, though, is to talk about compliments, right? Because that's a question that comes up. You know, why can't I say, ooh, Sally, you look great in that little red dress, right? What's wrong with that? And on the workplace, it's actually pretty easy to talk about. I want to give all the women here language to talk about that. Compliments, by definition, are supposed to make the recipient feel good. They're not about the giver, you know, strutting his ego or whatever. They're supposed to make the recipient feel good, right? Definition of a compliment, right? On the job, what makes people feel good is being respected for the quality of their work, right? That was a terrific report. You handled that meeting beautifully, whatever. Being told that you look good is not the point, right? You're not there as a decorative object in most jobs. So being told that she looks good is a way of, again, involuntarily sexualizing a woman instead of treating her in her role as a coworker. Let me give an example of that, right? I don't know the names of these people in the front row, but I'm going to call them Jack, Tom, and Harry, right? Jack, that was a great report. I really thought it was excellent. I think he'll do the job, right? Tom? Tom, you just did a wonderful job at that meeting. I'm so impressed. Thanks, guy. Can you take the meeting next week? You know, it's got to go well, but I think you can do it. Harry, that is a really nice tie. What did I just do to Harry? All right? It's a put down. It's a shot. All right? I complimented those two on something that mattered, the meat and potatoes, the quality of their work, their skills, their abilities. All right? I complimented Harry on his appearance. If Harry feels put down, he's exactly right to feel that way. And that's what's done to women all the time when 90% or 95% or 100% of the comments we get are about how we look. Right? So what I tell guys is if you give a woman you work with 10 comments on the quality of her work, great report, great meeting, great job, right? You are then allowed on number 11 to say, by the way, great scarf. Right? But if the ratio is reversed, that you are communicating a very important message about yourself as a male, which is that you don't care whether she does a good job. It doesn't matter to you if she's smart. It only matters to you if she looks good and meets your aesthetic values. Right? The actual message that's being conveyed is not about the woman at all. It's about the man who does not take women seriously as coworkers. If men realized for 1 second how revealing their harassing comments are about they themselves, they'd stop overnight. So that's compliments. Touch, the same thing. I do a little exercise with, usually I pick the most senior guy in the room, I bring him up to the front of the room. We talk about the dynamics of touch, starting with being patted on the head, extremely condescending, By the time I work down to the point where I would, although I usually don't, actually swat his rear end, he is so nervous. And I point out that he's actually very safe. He's in a room full of men, right? He's got witnesses for days, right? He doesn't have to work with me. He doesn't have to ever see me again. And I'm not actually a physical threat. I'm not going to assault him or follow up in any way. And he's still really nervous that I might actually touch his rear end. Right? The politics of touch, the dynamics of touch are part of it. The kind of subtle innuendo that goes on. There are lots of tricks. There's the, oh boy, the introducing everybody in the room except the one woman at the meeting trick, the invisibility trick. There's the inferior-superior trick, right, where every time you see a male-female team walk into an office, you automatically assume the male is the woman's boss, right? All of those behaviors are social practices. They can be named, they can be talked about, they can be handled assertively or confrontationally. Together, they can indeed create a hostile environment that is illegal sex discrimination under the law, right? That kind of consistent pattern of small shots all the time, right? Making women invisible, reducing women's effectiveness, has real repercussions, not just for women, but for firms as well.
Thank you, Marty. We've got a bunch of questions and not much time, so I'm going to ask you to do your questions quickly and ask our panel to be brief. Next.
As a former Oregonian living in Washington, D.C. at the time that this story broke, I was really shocked that the Oregonian didn't break this story. And I heard from friends just rumors that, that they had actually had the story floating around the city room or whatever for a long time, and that it had never made it through into a real story. And I was just curious if that rumor was true, if you know have any insights on that, about what really happened.
Alan Oda, would you like to address that? Or the Washington bureau chief of the Oregonian is here. He's a Neiman Fellow.
I didn't see the...
Briefly, Alan, you'll be off the hook.
I just wanted to say that it's a complicated, the answer to your question is rather complicated. The Oregonian did run a story about actually Julie Williamson's experience, but it didn't name Julie or the senator under an agreement with the source at the time. And this ran in about April, as I recall. March. And so the Oregonian did know about one of the stories. I guess in hindsight, now that we know there were many other cases, that should have been a signal to us that this was out there. But I think I can say that, at least from my knowledge, it was not common knowledge in the newsroom that he was abusing his employees to that extent. I should say that we knew of Florence's efforts about 2 weeks before the election. And at that point, Florence might not know this.
No, I knew you
Perhaps
knew about me a long time before that.
We knew.
They were breathing down my neck.
But it was an editorial judgment 2 weeks out from the election based on the senator and his top aides' flat denial of some discreet questioning that we put to, in this case it was his chief of staff. We asked her whether he was A, talking to the Post, and B, whether there was anything to these rumors, and she denied it. It was an editorial judgment at that point that there was not enough time within 2 weeks to fairly report on the story, and there was fear that the mere reporting of the story would create rumors in the community and not allow for a fair election. Mm-hmm. I think that in hindsight now, I would like to think that we would not make the same decision, or at least we might make the same decision, but we would consider other factors. And I think that, frankly, if I was in the same position I am now, and this came up in another election, in an identical situation, I would have been much more forceful. I was forceful in advocating going after Florence at that time, 2 weeks out from the election, but I would have been even more forceful. And I think that what we've learned is that the Senate is unable to, it's been unable to, there are constitutional problems, which is another long discussion, but Senator Packwood cannot be denied his seat in Congress despite the fact that he is probably guilty of these activities.
Disagree,
And
disagree,
so,
I'm sorry.
well, I just think that what I have learned and what my newspaper is going through this process is that the Constitution, because of these constitutional problems, the press just has an extreme duty to perform this investigative function before the election. Because in essence, he's been elected for 6 years, and it looks very unlikely that there will be any serious action taken against him.
Okay. I'm going to let Judge Roberts, briefly, Judge
Well,
Roberts,
I'm
because
it will be
they're
quick.
giving me this signal.
It will be fast. Constitutionally, the U.S. Constitution says that the Congress will determine the qualifications of its own members. They can determine he is not qualified to serve, and he can be expelled. That has happened over and over and over, and we have the cases. It has happened many times in the U.S. Senate. Those cases were argued before the Rules Committee on the election fraud issue, and he can be expelled. But I do want to say something about the Oregonian. Alan has played a very admirable role as a reporter at the Oregonian. I'm here, frankly, figuratively today supporting the women, but that's been my role in Oregon all through this, to line them up with lawyers and to help raise some funds so that they have the support and get a lot of people to give them the necessary support, both emotionally and moral, to help keep their morale up and to help them financially as we can. But the Oregonian, their own reporter in the spring of 1992, after an interview with Bob Packwood, was given one of his famous kisses. And so, and that, all the reporters knew this. Now, I know what you say, Florence, that what some of the reporters know doesn't get to the editors. And that's what happened, I think, at the Oregonian, was that all of this didn't get to the editors. But what was going on in this case was common knowledge in Oregon all during the election. It got to be a status symbol at every fundraiser and every cocktail party all during that campaign of who had talked to Florence Graves last. And so the Oregonian knew exactly that this story was going forward, and at one point they had a special reporter on it in 1992 to carry on the investigation. She didn't get anywhere, she had to leave the paper, but there was more to it than just the fact that this little article ran in March of 1992. I do want to say the Oregonian's doing a fantastic job now. They have hired additional staff, that they are working very hard, and Don Hamilton is here from the Washington Bureau also, and they have a person who's been hired to work on it in Washington, D.C. They've put one person on it full-time in Portland to work from it from the Oregon angle, and the Oregonian is working exceedingly hard so that they can develop this case as a newspaper should, and I think they're dedicated to doing it, and I think they will do it.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Well, I think
I'm sorry.
come here under...
Sir,
Oh,
I
sorry.
discriminated.
Excuse me?
They're telling me that I discriminated by not switching. So can I do you next?
Sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I was questions for Elizabeth.
Started this training right here.
But in terms of how you described how the whole process is a real long haul, for women who do want to make complaints, what can we do to, is a matter of changing laws, making different policies to make it so it won't be such a burden to go through years of deliberations and lots of money, because that's really a big thing. How can we change that just to make it easier while still protecting people who are accused of it in terms of having their rights protected as well?
Is there somebody you want to direct this question to?
Yeah.
I was talking to Liz McKenna.
Well,
Okay.
that's...
Liz, you got to be fast.
It's a long haul process. I get somebody other than Clarence Thomas at the EEOC. I mean, I think that's an organization that actually could make great strides. They'd have to change a lot of the way they do business, and Congress would have to change some things. But this should be a simple process. So that's really where I'd rewrite laws
Thanks.
related to that.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Well, I was just going to point to what seems to be the nature of this, which is a rally against Senator Packwood rather than a forum meeting, which is meant to discuss the issue of just how guilty he is, of what he might be guilty, whether he is indeed guilty. And I take it there are a fair number of people who support Senator Packwood in Oregon and outside of Oregon, and who have a different attitude towards the harassment issue generally. And it surprises me that at the K School, where we generally have more balanced fora, that this one seems to be completely unbalanced, to be, in fact, lined up with people who have axes to grind against Senator Packwood. Was any effort made to get someone who would present his side more sympathetically?
Let me answer that, if you would. I am, in fact, from Washington, D.C. I don't know that I've ever been to Oregon in my life. I've never met Mr. Packwood, and I consider myself not only an expert on sexual harassment, but a highly objective observer of this social practice. And I must say I resent your implication that we are here on some kind of vendetta. I think the facts in this case are very clear, and in fact, Packwood has admitted a great deal of his behavior. The question here is not what he did, but really, will the Senate take responsible action? And I would like to ask all of you who are political scientists and students of government what you think we can do to make sure that we have government that really represents the people. Because when this behavior is going on at the highest levels, in fact, it is women who are being silenced, women's interests that are not being represented. This is not democracy when half the population is being subjected to this behavior.
Well,
and that, I think, is a policy issue here. What can the Senate do to be more responsible?
I think we could spend one more second defending Senator Packwood. For one thing, it seems like you have made up your mind that he is guilty, so your pretense to objectivity is one that's undermined by that very statement. The fact that there are two complaining witnesses as part of the panel suggests that it's not entirely objective. And I take it that a former justice would recognize that in general it is inappropriate to present what looks like the plaintiff's case without any suggestion of what the defense case might be like. Now, this particular former justice, as I understand, you ran against Packwood previously in some election?
So many years ago, I can hardly remember it.
Okay. But
Well, let her respond. You've directed something to her. Let's let her respond.
What your sense of justice tells you about this arrangement.
Both sides in Oregon have said we want a fair hearing. And Senator Packwood has said that, and he has a few people who have spoken out publicly in his behalf saying that. The point, I think, is that he admitted these things. In his first press conference, after he went to the alcohol rehabilitation place for a week and he came back, he hadn't confronted any of the reporters who wanted to ask him questions. And he came back and he held a press conference. And he said, I just didn't get it then. I do now. And he said, I apologize, and he really went on the record.
I was just plain wrong.
I was just plain wrong, he said. Now, so what we're talking about here is not Senator Packwood being on trial. We're talking about the allegations that he has admitted to. And I think that probably if you want to get into what kinds of defenses he may have, there might be, well, I was a victim of changing mores. You know, it used to be okay, now today it's not. And, you know, there are arguments that say, well, it really wasn't okay yesterday, but he's entitled to that defense. He may have the defense, well, this doesn't meet the legal definition of sexual harassment. Yeah, and it doesn't. It's worse than that. You know, it would be the other side of the story. You know, that really in some cases it was sexual assault. He has some defenses. But just remember this, that Senator Packwood is on the floor of the Senate every day with the 99 other senators who are going to make a decision on this. He is able to talk to them. He is able to socialize with them. He is able to trade votes with them. He is able to withhold some things that maybe they want for their constituents. He works in committees with them. He sees the ethics committee members. He works with them. We don't have that access to those senators.
Oh, I don't deny that there's an imbalance of access, and I think it's fine that there be
We want to take, we have one last question over here.
My question wasn't answered, which was really, was anyone asked who had sympathy for Packwood's position to be on the panel? That was the question.
I'm not fully aware of all the people who were asked to be on the panel, but I think that for the most part, this panel has tried to go beyond that case. Most of the people here have been addressing issues about the societal issues, and I think they've done it beautifully. One last question.
also like to get off the Packwood case and ask a more general question. As an undergraduate, I'm not a victim. I was just subjected to a lot of low-grade sexual harassment to the extent that I changed how I dressed and almost dropped out of the honors program. I've seen some unconscious kinds of things also happening here at the Kennedy School, and have confronted a couple of people pretty successfully, but I was wondering if you had any stories about successful methods of confrontation in an academic setting, especially given the power dynamics of a professor and a student.
Yes. There are in the book a number of stories from women in universities, both students and employees of universities. And in fact, it goes on a fair amount. I think the university community is in some ways easier to deal with, though, not because it's not happening, but because you have a community of friends you can talk to. You have a built-in network of allies. We should say here, too, something I think hasn't been said explicitly, which is that the normal pattern of harassment is that the harasser has targeted many women. It's rare that he's just going after one woman that he's fixated on. In fact, it's normally any young woman available or any woman, period, that he has access to. And so the first step in a university is to talk to the other women students. Odds are they've had some kind of incident from the same guy. Strategize with them. Go to the women deans. Go to supportive men. As I said, more and more men, I think, get it and are willing to say to the harasser, you know, back off, Jack. This is not okay anymore. One of the most effective low-key techniques is to ask other professors to confront the professor. Right? One of the most powerful techniques is for a large group of women students to confront him in his office with a list of particulars. On Tuesday at 10:15, you did this to Sally. On Tuesday at 10:14, you did this to Mary. We know about it. We're all watching you. It stops right now. A group confrontation takes practice and planning, but it can be done. You have many techniques. I encourage you to get the book, use them, and be creative, too.
One other thing I'd like to add to that is sometimes an anonymous note can be helpful. It can lay it out, and yet you don't have to disclose your name. You also should consider going to the administration. I'm shocked sometimes. I've even had a situation where a law professor has gone to the dean of the law school and they didn't know what to do. Now that's pretty sad in this country. But the administration, management has to do something. If they receive information that is likely, that may constitute sexual harassment, they have a legal obligation to do it, even if you don't want your name to be shared. They now have this situation before them, and they run the risk of liability. So consider those sources too, and do something about it. Don't just take it.
Let me leave you with one last thought, and that is that I think it's one of the things that we hope, all of us hope, that got communicated to all of you. Judith Jordan said to me that silence is the enemy of change. The more women who speak up, the more women who support one another, the faster things will change. I want to thank all of you for coming. We appreciate your attention, and thank all of you for educating us. These women are willing to stay around and answer questions if you have questions, so feel free to.
An appointment. I think we may have an appointment.
She's willing to stay.
Are we getting together for dinner? Do we ever decide
I
that?
haven't made any plans, and I've got to talk to my sister-in-law, sort of